Thank you very much for the welcome. It brings me back a long way to when I first met some of those people who've been here for over 30 years, to remember what we all looked like in those days. Right? In fact, I guess I don't recognize half of you anyway. Anyways, it's been fascinating to watch what's been going on over the last little while between all of you and the city. And it's so good to be here tonight to feel a strong representation and belief from both the city and all of you, because without that this would not be a success. So that's congratulations to both sides for coming together to do this. I just know it won't happen without that. Anyway, I've been asked to talk about the past, and I've got 10 minutes to get from 1772 to today. So I think some staff may wave at me later on if I go too long. Yes? Okay. So by all means tell me to stop and I'll shorten anything I get involved with. I tend to want to get involved with this because this is a remarkable experiment that became a success. Looking back in 1970s when it was a similar sort of circumstance going on with a council that was getting a little bit out of gear and a citizenry that was becoming aware of it. And that was happening the same in Toronto. And eventually it sort of collapsed into a reform government. And as a consequence of the reform government, what you've got now happened. It was to do with the return to good principles, from principles that were getting muddled and confused by the economic circumstances and the way development was done at the time. And I think we're somewhere there again now, and I'm looking forward to 2018 and seeing how much of a reform that will create. So that's a bit dangerous for me to get involved with. So I'll turn now to 1772. I don't think I have a pointer, do I? I don't. So unfortunately, I won't have a pointer. So this is a scene you all recognize, including, you notice the First Nations are there, and Captain Vancouver is sitting in his boat wondering who they are, and he's wondering who they are. And we now here as a result of that interface. And you can see False Creek, and that's not a log boom there, that's a little island that became Granville Island, I guess, on that one. And it's interesting to observe what that all means now. As we look at this, we are looking at this as it's shown on that screen with what we've done on top of it. So what we've done on top of it is basically this. This is only, that's about 1990 something, that scheme, but you can see how human beings have infiltrated onto that wonderful environment and created the wonderful environment that we now have. So it went through a whole lot of phases, did False Creek. False Creek actually started as a planning exercise in about 1968, when I think the city developed its first local area planning committee for False Creek. And that took a long time after that for anything to happen, because it didn't start to happen until about 1973. Now, in the meantime, there was World War II, and World War I came first, of course, and after that we had the Bartholomew Plan. And that Bartholomew Plan said False Creek should be the industrial port for the City of Vancouver. The railways had arrived, and it was determined that this would be a good use for this part, and the Burrard Inlet would be the commercial part of the port. So as a consequence, it did develop as an industrial area, and it became a total wasteland of forestry products and heavy-duty factories, and the water was contaminated by all sorts of people who lived around it in shacks, and it became a real environmental disaster. Some of this can be seen in, this was apparently a fairly typical thing in the 40s that happened, and that's a picture of False Creek. I could say it was a picture of False Creek South, but I might be exaggerating, but nevertheless, you get the message about what it was like. And this is, when I came in 1973, this was sort of still the circumstances of some of the waterfront areas around False Creek. So you can imagine the council having a bit of a challenge to know what should they do. And so after lots of discussion and lots of searches for alternative ways, including those who still wanted to be industrial, and those who wanted it to be commercial, and those who wanted to be park, and those who wanted to be residential, Eventually they came up with an agreement that it ought to be more residential. And if you think of this is a plan from 1971, which the planners put together to see what we could do with the creek. And if you think of that as primarily industrial at the time that was done, and looking like those pictures beforehand, this was done, and it shows the whole of the creek developed residential. I've just been told I'm halfway through my talk. I think I've gone to 1971, so I'm going to fast. This is going to be fast. Important thing then, and I think these people are still important today, funnily enough, but we relied totally on the experts around the world who told us how to do planning properly. So we had Jane Jacobs. I won't read these all out. I was going to tell you all about them. It's a fascinating story, but I haven't got the time. So you need to check these out. Christopher Alexander, Ian McHarg, Saul Alinsky. Profoundly important people to planning then, profoundly important today, for all the reasons you'll find out when you read them. It was the time too when we were starting to do legitimate outreach to people. So the image survey still goes on today. Ken King is still doing his diagrams for people, showing happy people flying through pedestrian cycleways under trees and flying kites and things, which everybody seems to want, but nevertheless we need to draw it every time to remind the planners that it's not just all urban. This is a very important document. I would like to read all of that and explain them to you, but I don't have time. I'm getting this sort of reaction from it, so I don't have time. But look at that and get this, because this is profoundly important to what happens in the future in Falls Creek. You must have your principles set out, and you mustn't give up on the principles. And I'm going to squeeze a minute out at the end if I don't get time to read you a quote from one of the major reports that was written soon after the scheme was done to say how it was occurring. So this you're all familiar with. This was a goal that was met. And it wasn't sure it would be met because the financial circumstances were pretty tricky then. And I'll explain later if I get time why they're not just tricky today. But nevertheless, the idea that you'd have the population composed of a third low income, a third middle income, and a third high income, and all live together happily, was a little bit radical in the time. But as we all know, I think, from what has happened, it's been a raging success in terms of the sense of community that came from all this work that other people do. I was reminded when Richard introduced himself, I should have introduced myself the same way, that while I was director of planning there, I was one guy standing in front of hundreds of people, very gifted people who worked so hard to create all this, from politicians to developers to citizens to experts. And that was just wonderful to be part of a team that were all committed to these objectives. This was the format which you'll read in Christopher Alexander, which is the first plan for Area 1, Phase 1, and you'll recognise parts of it, but you'll notice some interesting little changes here and there, which I'd describe to you in some detail if I had the time. And as it got further west, you'll notice it became a higher density, and we all know why, and that was partly to do with the scale of what was around it. And so today, we have this wonderful contrast. And here is the development starting at about 1976 in the foreground. And I'm halfway through my presentation. How am I doing? I'll skip here. So there's this, and so it became what you know it to be. And this is looking across the way. And of course, is this the future? Or is that the past? Or is it necessary? Or should we have it? Do people want it? So I'm going to read these quotes. You give me another minute. I want to read these quotes if I can find them now. The first one was from a very important report. It's still one of the best reports there is about how Falls Creek happened, by a person called Ruth Rogers, who was commissioned by the Ministry of Urban Affairs to report on how did Falls Creek occur. This was about 1977, I think, her report. And in amongst it, she says this, which I find fascinating as we worry today about how we can afford things. She said, "But rather remarkably, the general objective of creating a quality, livable environment seem to have taken a distinct priority for some time over the financial aspects of the redevelopment. And that's sort of key, because we're driven so much by, oh, you can't afford it, or we can't do it these days. But of course, in those days, we had the support of the federal government, and we had a minister in Ron Bastard who worked his off in order to provide the money to help get this done. And we're going to need that again. And I've just noticed that the federal government has given millions of dollars to Toronto to improve its sidewalks. And it seemed to me this is more important than the sidewalk. So we need to get that. And then the other quote I have, if I can find it, is from somebody who I seem to have lost. Why could I remember one and not the other? So I've forgotten that. It was from the mayor at the time. And he said, this was a mayor who had watched over all of this and guided it through. And he said, this would not have happened without a collective will on the part of so many different people in order to get where we got to. And he thanked everybody, including the junior planner and the senior planner and the expensive man. I can remember, for example, the contractor, one of the contractors at the time, I used to bump into at the weekends as I was walking around wondering how it was getting on, and he was there with a truck full of trees because he wanted to improve on the environment even though he wasn't getting paid anymore for the trees. And there was that whole atmosphere that was created by that, and I hope you do the same in the future. And my time has run out, and thank you very much.